They called her the Widow of Rothermere, and for once in her life, the name was not a lie dressed up as gossip. She had, in fact, buried a duke. What the name never told you was that she had buried him without a single tear at 19 years old, walked out of that church a duchess and a fortune both, and spent the 14 years since proving to anyone foolish enough to test her that she had not needed the title to be dangerous. She had only needed it to be believed. Adeline Vane, Dowager Duchess of Rothermere, had a smile that closed drawing rooms, and a signature that made grown men check their contracts twice before they slid them across her desk. And 14 years before this story properly begins, she proved every rumor ever whispered about her entirely true in the space of 1 week, and then spent the years afterward pretending, to herself most of all, that the week had never happened. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and whether you believe a woman like her can ever truly change, or whether some debts simply wait, quiet and patient, until the exact day they come due. I read every single one, and if you're the sort of listener who likes a story where power finally meets its match in the very last place it expects to find it, subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to a channel like this one. Adeline had not been born to any of it. That fact mattered more than anyone in her later circles ever knew, because it was the exact thing that made her dangerous in the first place. Her father had been a clerk in the excise office, careful with candles, careful with coal, and her mother had stretched 1 joint of mutton across a week of Sunday dinners, and somewhere in all that counting and stretching, something in young Adeline had decided, quietly and permanently, that she would never again be a woman who had to ask twice for anything from anyone for the rest of her natural life. At 19, she married the 6th Duke of Rothermere, a widower of 61, with gout in both feet and no living heir, for reasons that satisfied everybody's curiosity except the true one. He died within 2 years, leaving her a townhouse in Mayfair, a country seat in Kent she never once cared to visit, and a fortune large enough that nobody in London thought to question why a duke's young widow chose, instead of mourning quietly, to turn her hand to trade. By 30, she had 4 warehouses along the river, and half a fleet of merchant ships running silk and tea out of the east, and a name that opened doors before her carriage had finished stopping outside them. By 33, the year everything changed, she had a partner named Marcus Ashcombe, a shipping merchant she had built 2 ventures with over 9 careful years, a man who trusted her enough to let her advance £9,000 toward a warehouse property neither of them had technically finished closing on. It was the kind of arrangement 2 old partners settled with a handshake and a decade of shared history, the kind that should never once have needed a solicitor standing between them. The property deal stalled the way such deals in London always seem to stall. A seller who smelled money in the air and grew greedy at the last possible moment. A registry office that misplaced the same deed twice in 6 weeks. Silence stretching where signatures ought to have been. Marcus told her, more than once, to be patient. Adeline had never once in her life been patient with anything that had her own money sitting inside it, and she told him so, more than once, in exactly the tone that sent junior clerks searching for urgent reasons to leave the room. She did not call a solicitor. She made 3 quiet arrangements instead, and 2 nights later, 4 hired men walked into Marcus Ashcombe's riverside warehouse at 11 o'clock at night and left with considerably more than £9,000 worth of anything at all. They took the hold nearest the loading door, which happened to belong to an entirely separate consignment, a shipment of Indian silk worth nearly triple what Adeline had put into the property deal to begin with. By the time Marcus arrived at 7 the next morning, his warehouse floor was bare, but for scattered packing straw and a padlock cut clean through, with shears that had cost more than most of his clerks earned in a year. He sent word to her house 11 times that day. She received him on the 12th, and when he asked her, his voice unsteady in a way she had genuinely never heard from him in 9 years of friendship, whether she knew anything at all of it, she told him she was very sorry to hear he had been robbed, and that she sincerely hoped his underwriters were in good order. Marcus Ashcombe lost 11 years of accumulated work in a single night, and he never once got a straight word out of her again. Not through solicitors, not through the two mutual friends who tried for years afterward to broker some manner of quiet peace, not even, eventually, through the courts of chancery, which found, after 2 exhausting years of filings, that there simply wasn't enough directly connecting a duchess to men who had, conveniently, never once been identified. He was not the only one she left standing in a doorway that year. Her younger brother, Edmund, had been finishing his studies abroad at the time, and before he sailed, he had signed 2 family properties over to Adeline for what he called safekeeping, a modest terrace house their late grandmother had left them jointly, and a small parcel of land near the old market their father had bought slowly, painfully, on a clerk's wage that never once kept pace with the price of anything. Edmund trusted his elder sister the way younger brothers trust elder sisters, who have always seemed, for as long as he could remember, to know precisely what they were about. She sold both properties within 18 months, quietly, in pieces, before his ship had even fully cleared the channel on its way home, and by the time he tried to trace the buyers, the paperwork was so many hands deep that no solicitor in London could have untangled it in a decade. Their father learned of it from a neighbour at somebody else's wedding breakfast, not from his own daughter, not in a letter, not even by messenger. He was 71 at the time, a proud, careful man who had never once in his life raised his voice at either child, and people who knew him before that evening said, for years afterward, that he never fully got his voice back once it was over, that something in the way he spoke went permanently softer, slower, like a man who had quietly decided there was simply no further point in raising it about anything at all. There was, in the middle of all of it, a brief window where it nearly did cost her something. A young barrister named Miss Rebecca Hale, no relation to anyone of consequence, taken on by Marcus at a fraction of the usual fee, because no established chambers in London would touch a suit against a duchess with Adeline's reach, spent 4 months building what she genuinely believed was an airtight case, shipping manifests, a carter willing to swear to the men he'd driven to the warehouse that night, a night watchman's sworn deposition about the padlock. Miss Hale filed on a Monday morning, certain she had at last found the crack in 14 years of untouchable armor. By Thursday, the carter had recanted his statement entirely, citing a sudden and lucrative posting in the north. By the following Monday, the watchman had simply stopped answering his door, and a fortnight after that, quietly, without explanation, he and his family had removed to a town 200 miles away, into a cottage considerably finer than anything his old wages could have furnished. Miss Hale never learned precisely what it had cost the Duchess to make her case disappear, only that it had disappeared completely, along with most of her own appetite for taking suits against people who could simply buy the truth back whenever they needed it. Nobody touched Adeline Vane for any of it, not really, not in any way that ever cost her a thing. She had money enough to see 3 separate suits fold quietly, one after another, and standing enough in the world that men twice the size of anyone who might have considered confronting her simply stood at her gate all day and made the entire question academic before it could even be asked. The whispers followed her regardless, into drawing rooms where hostesses suddenly recalled other engagements, into church pews where women smiled at her over their prayer books and picked her entirely apart the moment she stepped outside, into the private correspondence of women who had once called themselves her dearest friends. But whispers, she had learned a very long time ago, do not move money. Money was the only language that had ever truly mattered to Adeline Vane, and for 14 years she spoke it fluently, alone. From the very top of a house, nobody else was ever quite invited to visit properly. 14 years is, however, a genuinely long time to sit at the top of something, and slowly come to understand that nobody beneath you actually likes you. It is long enough, even for a woman like Adeline Vane, to start wanting something no fortune had ever once been able to purchase her, and to understand clearly, somewhere around the 11th year, staring out over a city that no longer surprised her, that she would never get it while surrounded by people who already knew, in exhausting detail, exactly who she was. She sold 2 of her 4 remaining warehouses through an agent nobody could trace back to her true name, moved the proceeds through 3 different banking houses on the continent before they finally landed somewhere clean, and one grey morning, she took the North Road out of London under a new name, procured quietly through a solicitor who asked no questions, and she did not look back at the city once. Nobody in Edinburgh knew who Adeline Vane used to be, and for the first 8 months, that single fact alone felt like more air than she had breathed freely in over a decade. To the people in her new life, she was simply Mrs. Adeline Hartley, a widow of modest but respectable means, sharp, elegant, precise, in a way that made strangers trust her, almost before they'd learned her surname. She took a small set of rooms above a printer's shop on a quiet street off the new town, built a modest trading concern out of nothing but old contacts and her own considerable will, engaged a clerk named Nora Fenwick, whom she paid a full quarter above the going wage, for reasons she never fully explained even to herself, and constructed, slowly and deliberately, a life that had almost nothing in common with the one she'd left south of the border. She learned the small things a new city teaches, without ever formally asking. Which coffee house on her own corner remembered her order by the 3rd visit? How the Har rolled in off the Firth some mornings thick enough to swallow the castle whole. That nobody here flinched when she entered a room. That nobody's shoulders dropped half an inch the way they used to at home. That here she was simply allowed to be a woman who was very good at her trade and reasonably good company besides. That this, apparently, could be the whole of the story, with nothing hidden underneath it that anyone was waiting to uncover. For the first time since she was perhaps 19 years old, Adeline, Mrs. Hartley now, always only Mrs. Hartley, let herself genuinely want an ordinary life instead of a larger one, and she was surprised, some evenings, by how much that wanting felt like grief for a version of herself she had never once gotten to live. She met Julian Farrow on a Thursday evening in October. At a subscription concert neither of them had truly planned to attend. He'd come as a favor to a client. She'd come because Nora had bought the tickets and then developed a sudden and suspicious cold. He kept a small architect's practice 3 streets from her own office, the kind that took on perhaps 6 real commissions a year, garden temples, a new wing here, a folly there, and turned away twice that number, and he had a laugh loud enough that 3 separate parties turned to look at their corner of the hall before the evening was through. He did not know for the first 4 months of knowing her that the woman he was falling for had once signed her name beside a duke's, because she never once let it come up naturally, and for once in her life, keeping the truth quiet felt like genuine relief instead of careful strategy. They built something ordinary together, one small piece at a time. Saturday mornings at the flower market, 3 streets from his rooms, where he taught her the names of blooms she'd never once had reason to learn, in a life spent mostly among ledgers. A stray, grey-muzzled dog neither of them had planned on, whom they named Biscuit, and ended up sharing custody of, before either had so much as said the word love aloud. Suppers with his younger sister Cecilia, who never once asked what Mrs. Hartley's family had been, who simply liked her, plainly and without any hidden design, in a way that made Adeline's chest ache in places she hadn't fully realized were still capable of aching after everything. There was one evening, early on, when a Mr. Desmond Cray, an old school friend of Julian's, loud, handsome, a little too free with his hands after the second bottle of claret, cornered her in the narrow passage outside Julian's dining room and told her, his palm resting a beat too long at her waist, that a woman who looked like her shouldn't be wasting her evenings on a struggling architect when there were men in this city who could keep her in the manner she was so plainly used to. Adeline stood very still, the exact way she used to stand in a counting house right before she said something that ended a man's career, and told him quietly to remove his hand. He laughed instead, and did not. She never found out what she might have done next, because Julian appeared at the end of the passage without hurrying, and Cray's hand came off her waist so fast it was almost comic. Julian did not raise his voice. He simply told Desmond it was time he called for his coat, and stood there, arms folded, until the front door had shut behind him. "You didn't have to do that," Adeline said afterward, once the rooms had emptied. "I could have managed him myself." "I know you could have," Julian said. "I wanted to anyway. There's a difference between someone who needs rescuing and someone who simply shouldn't have to do the rescuing alone, every single time." He looked at her a long moment. "Is that what it's been like for you? Always alone in it?" Adeline did not answer that night, but she turned the question over for weeks afterward, the way she used to turn over a difficult contract, looking for the clause she'd missed, and she found, to her own genuine surprise, that no one had ever once asked her that in her entire adult life. There was an evening, 7 months into knowing him, when Julian asked her directly why she'd left London at all, and Adeline came nearer the truth than she had come with anyone in years, without ever quite reaching it. "I built something I didn't like the shape of," she told him, turning her glass slowly on the table between them, watching the candlelight move through it. "I decided I would rather begin again, somewhere nobody could hold the old shape up beside the new one, and ask me to explain the difference." "That isn't really an answer," Julian said gently, not pushing, only noticing. "No," Adeline agreed. "It isn't." And she left it there, and he let her, and neither of them yet knew that the not pushing would, within 2 years, become the exact opening he needed. She let herself believe, quietly, carefully, that 300 miles and 14 years of distance was enough to make her a genuinely different woman. She was wrong about that, though not at all in the way she eventually expected to be wrong, and the woman about to prove it to her wasn't even trying. Grace Pemberton had kept the household books in the Rothermere townhouse for 3 years, back when Adeline still answered to her own true name, and signed it on things that mattered. Grace had not been of any consequence to her mistress in those days. She copied letters, carried tea into rooms she was not asked to remain in, and left before anyone said anything worth remembering afterward. But she had been under that roof the very week the warehouse affair broke open, had watched 2 separate solicitors come and go through the hall within a single afternoon, had overheard enough, in the particular unguarded way people talk in front of the girl who pours the tea, to understand, even at 22, precisely what manner of woman she served. Grace left the household 8 months later, quietly, without giving a true reason, and removed to Edinburgh 6 years after that to train as a nurse. On a bursary she had worked 11 separate positions across 3 years to earn. She had not thought of the Dowager Duchess of Rothermere in a genuinely long while by the time it happened. Not until an ordinary Saturday morning at the flower market, 3 streets from lodgings she had never once seen, where she watched a tall, unmistakable woman laugh over a basket of hothouse roses with a gentleman whose hand rested easily, comfortably, at the small of her back. The ground tilted a little under Grace's feet. She would tell people afterward, much later, that she had known instantly, before her mind had even properly caught up to naming the face, the way one knows a scent from childhood before it can be placed. Adeline did not recognize her at all. Why would she? Grace had been furniture behind a writing desk, a face never once worth the trouble of filing away. They did not speak. Grace bought her flowers with hands that were not entirely steady and walked 3 streets in the wrong direction entirely before realizing she was moving away from her own lodgings, and she sat with what she had seen for 3 full days before she let herself do anything about it. She did not confront her directly. She had watched, 6 years before, precisely what tended to happen to people who confronted Adeline Vane head-on, and had no genuine wish to become a cautionary tale a second time in her life. Instead, she found Farrow's practice listed in a trade directory. It took very little searching. His name was printed plainly enough: Farrow, Architect, 6 completed commissions. And she spent the better part of an evening composing a letter she rewrote 6 times before finally sealing it and sending it round by hand. "Sir, I do not know you, and I hope this does not seem a madness. I once kept the household books for the lady you are courting. I do not believe she has told you who she truly is. Ask her the name Marcus Ashcombe, and ask her what became of her own brother's houses. I am sorry. I could not watch it happen to another and say nothing. She sent it round at 11 o'clock that night and slept poorly for 3 days afterward, entirely certain she had made a very grave mistake with a lady who had once, according to household legend, made grown men stand at her gate for hours without complaint. Julian read the letter by candlelight the following morning and very nearly set it in the grate. His first instinct, the one he actually acted upon for the better part of that day, was to take it for a mistake, a confused stranger, perhaps some old rival of Mrs. Hartley's, perhaps nothing at all worth losing sleep over. He came close to burning it twice before his own business had even properly finished for the morning. He did not, in the end. Something about the sheer particularity of it stopped his hand both times. The name Marcus Ashcombe was not the sort of detail a stranger merely invented, and the line about her brother's houses sat in his stomach like a stone he could not shift loose for the rest of that day, through 2 client calls and 1 thoroughly unproductive site visit. That evening, instead of calling on Mrs. Hartley as he usually did on Thursdays, without a second thought, he sat alone at his own writing table until nearly 1 in the morning, working through the subscription library's back numbers of the London Gazettes. It took him 4 old newspaper reports and 1 bound volume of a scandal sheet, half the print too small to read comfortably by candle, to understand that Grace had not invented a single word of it. The name on those pages was not Adeline Hartley, but the engraving attached to a 5-year-old society column stopped his breath entirely in his chest. Younger, harder about the eyes perhaps, dressed finer than anything he had ever seen her wear, but unmistakably, undeniably, the same woman who fell asleep most nights these days, with her head against his shoulder. The Dowager Duchess of Rothermere, the lady the city fears most, read the headline, and beneath it, a line that made his hands go briefly cold. No house in London dares question her. A second cutting, shorter and considerably angrier, plainly written by someone with a grudge he had not troubled to disguise. Ashcombe against Vane, the warehouse robbery no court could ever prove. A third piece, barely a paragraph, buried on the last page of an old trade weekly, mentioning almost in passing that her Grace's own younger brother had reportedly lost 2 inherited properties, under circumstances several family friends have described, off the record, as deeply troubling. He sat with all of it for a fortnight before he said a word to her about any of it. He watched her differently in that time, quietly, the practiced, almost invisible ease with which she once corrected a boy who had called her "my lady" by some clerical mistake, a correction so smooth and immediate it could only ever have come from years of quiet practice, covering the very same slip. By the time Julian finally sat her down on a quiet Sunday evening, the dog asleep in a heap between them, he was not really asking her a genuine question anymore. He already knew the whole of the answer, or near enough to it. He only needed, he told himself, to watch her face while she gave it to him properly, out loud. Adeline did not deny a single word of it. In 14 years of carefully rehearsing exactly 1 clean, controlled account of her past for every new person who ever entered her life, she found, in the one moment it mattered most, that she had nothing whatsoever left in reserve. Julian said the name Marcus aloud, plainly, without any real cruelty in his voice, and something in her simply, quietly, stopped pretending at all. "I want to hear it from you," he said. "Not the Gazette's version. Yours. All of it." She told him. Not everything. Not that first night. But enough. The warehouse. The 4 hired men she had paid without a flicker of hesitation. The 2 houses that had belonged to her own younger brother. Her father's face at a wedding breakfast she had not even been invited to, but had heard of anyway. Second-hand, years later, from someone who assumed she already knew. Her voice stayed level the entire time she spoke, which frightened Julian considerably more than tears from her would have done. "I need you to understand something," he said, once she had finally finished. "I am not going through with the wedding. Not like this, not with things I did not know, sitting beneath every single thing we have built." It was 3 weeks off by then. 200 guests already bidden. a hall engaged that could not now be given up without ruinous expense. A life half built already around one date, circled in his own diary, and Julian was standing in the middle of his own sitting room, quietly, calmly, telling her he could not finish walking toward it. Something in Adeline's face changed then, and it was not hurt, not entirely, not even mostly. It was the same cold, immediate recalculation that Marcus Ashcombe had once watched cross her features in a counting house, 11 years before, in the exact half-second before 4 hired men walked into his warehouse in the dark. "If you shame me 3 weeks before a wedding half this city already knows of," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet, in a way that made the dog lift his head from the hearthrug. "I will make certain your practice never sees another commission in this kingdom for as long as you live to want one. I still have money, Julian. I still have reach, even here. I gave up my country. I never once gave up the ability to write a single letter." It was not an empty threat, and they both understood that perfectly well in the moment. Julian sat with it 2 days longer, hating himself a little more with every hour spent circling it, and on the 3rd day he told her, in a voice with almost nothing genuine left inside it, that he would go through with the wedding after all. He did not tell her the true reason underneath that decision. He told himself, standing alone at his own washstand at 2 in the morning with the candle guttering for no reason at all, that it was because he still loved her, and on some nights that was even entirely true. But beneath that truth, quieter, colder, something else had already begun putting down roots. The growing, settling understanding that a woman capable of everything he had just spent a fortnight reading was not a woman a man could simply, cleanly walk away from without consequence. If he was to survive this, he decided that night, watching the candle drown itself in its own wax, he would have to be considerably cleverer about his own ending than she had ever once needed to be about anyone else's. They married on a bright, bitter Saturday in late November. 200 guests gathered in a country house overlooking a loch, caught with the first true ice of the year, and if anyone in that room marked the particular stiffness behind the groom's smile through the vows, no one said a word of it aloud, not even afterward, not even to one another in the carriage home. Cecilia wept openly through her own toast. Nora, Adeline's clerk, wept harder still, dabbing carefully at her eyes with a handkerchief she had plainly brought for the purpose. Grace Pemberton was not in the room, had never once seriously supposed she might be, and learned the wedding had gone forward at all only through a distant acquaintance a fortnight later, a small piece of second-hand news that sat in her stomach like something swallowed wrong. An old schoolfellow of Julian's, a dry, watchful man named Theodore Pike, who had come up from Bristol especially for the day and complained good-naturedly of the cold at every opportunity, stood beside Julian throughout, and noticed, more than once, the way his old friend's eyes tracked Adeline across the room, with something that looked less like plain joy and more like careful, ongoing calculation. He mentioned it once, lightly, over the port, and Julian laughed it off entirely, and Theodore, who had known him 15 years, let it go, though he thought of that look again, uneasily, nearly a year later, once everyone finally understood what had truly happened. What nobody foresaw that day, not Julian, not Grace, and least of all Adeline herself, was what happened quietly, gradually, in the months that followed. She fell for him properly. Not the practiced performance of it she had spent years learning to produce on command, in every room that had ever needed something of her, but something genuinely unguarded, something that frightened her a great deal more than any suit or any warehouse raid ever once had. She began telling him true things she had told no other living soul. What her father's voice had sounded like the last time she called upon him, 4 years after the houses were gone, and he had opened the door only to say nothing at all for a long moment before quietly closing it again without a word. How she still, more than a decade on, sometimes dreamed of the exact set of Marcus's face in his own warehouse doorway the next morning, the particular quality of silence in that dream, night after night, for years. She was, for what genuinely felt to her the very first time in her adult life, actually trying, in real and unglamorous ways, to become a woman worth staying for. Julian let her go on believing it was working perfectly. He held her at night, and some of those nights he genuinely meant every part of it, and that was, in its own quiet and terrible way, the very cruelest part of everything that followed, that it was never entirely purely false, that a man capable of eventually doing what he did to her could also, at the very same time, love her a little, right up until the precise morning he simply stopped. Because the whole while she was carefully opening herself to him, one true story at a time, Julian was occupied with something else altogether, quietly, methodically, patiently, during the very hours she believed he was at his drafting table, finishing a commission. He learned her strong boxes and her bankers' names, the same patient, deliberate way she had once learned other people's weaknesses, one careful conversation at a time. He found the Continental accounts first, 2 of them, held through a private banking house in Amsterdam, that asked remarkably few questions. He found the deeds next, one by one, over several careful weeks. A townhouse in Bath she had never once mentioned to him. A small warehouse in Bristol, held quietly under yet another false name entirely. He found, 11 months into the marriage, that she had begun, fatally, catastrophically, to trust him with the true shape and scope of what remained of her fortune, had begun leaving doors unlocked throughout her life that she had spent 14 years keeping deliberately, permanently bolted, because she had genuinely convinced herself, somewhere along the way, that love had finally, at long last, made her safe. Julian made 3 careful arrangements of his own on a quiet Tuesday in October, almost exactly a year to the day after the wedding, and every one of them was with a solicitor, practicing in a jurisdiction Adeline had never once thought to check. There was a physician in their circle by then, a quiet, watchful man named Dr. Daniel Mercer, who had known Julian since their student days, and had, over the 18 months of the marriage, become something close to a genuine friend to Adeline as well, the rare sort who asked after her actual week, and then sat still enough to truly hear the answer. Dr. Mercer had a habit, honed over years of reading frightened patients across an examining table, of noticing what people's faces did when they believed no one was watching closely. He noticed it at a supper in September, 6 weeks before everything came apart. Adeline had gone to see about the wine, and for just a moment, alone at the table, Julian's face did something Dr. Mercer could not immediately name. Not sadness exactly, nor guilt exactly either. Something nearer a man doing long division in his head, while everyone about him supposed he was merely admiring the tablecloth. "Are you quite well?" he asked him quietly, later, out on the terrace. "Never better," Julian said, and smiled the exact smile Dr. Mercer had known him to use since their student days, the one that meant a conversation was now officially concluded. Dr. Mercer let it go. He would think of that unfinished conversation for a long while afterward, turning it over the way one turns over a diagnosis nearly caught in time, and he would eventually tell Adeline, once it was all over, that he was sorry he had not pressed harder that night, that some quiet, unexamined part of him had marked that something was wrong and had chosen, out of an old loyalty, not to look at it too closely. Adeline would tell him, and mean it, that there had been nothing for him to catch, that she herself, sleeping beside the man every night, had not caught it either, and she had 30 years of practice reading exactly that sort of face. She woke in a coaching inn some 50 miles north of the city, with no reticule, no ring, and only a handful of worn shillings, sewn into the hem of a borrowed cloak that was not, she realized slowly, the one she had fallen asleep in. Her head ached in a particular, unfamiliar, chemical way that told her something in her wine the night before had not been only wine. There was a single note left upon the washstand, in a hand she recognized instantly, 4 words long and nothing more. "You will understand this best." It took her most of that first day merely to piece together how she had come to be there at all, and most of the following 3 to make her way back, a mile or 2 on a carrier's cart with a driver who talked nearly the whole way and never once thought to ask why an evidently well-bred woman had nothing on her person but a cloak, a stretch on the mail coach that spent most of her remaining shillings, and 6 miles on foot at the very end because there was simply nothing left to pay for anything smaller. By the time she reached her own lodgings, the landlady, who had wished her a genuinely warm good evening every day for over a year, looked at her now with the careful, pitying confusion of someone recently told something uncomfortable and doing her level best not to let it show. Her accounts were entirely empty, not merely drained in the ordinary way, restructured, removed, folded neatly into instruments she had no memory whatsoever of signing, but whose signatures, when a solicitor finally laid the full papers before her 3 exhausting weeks later, looked exactly, precisely like her own, close enough that no court in the kingdom would ever seriously entertain calling them forged. Her remaining properties had passed by a power of attorney clause buried quietly on the 11th page of a marriage settlement she had. In a fit of genuine trust she still could not quite credit herself capable of in hindsight, signed without ever reading twice. Julian Farrow was gone entirely, not merely from the house, not merely from her life, but from the kingdom altogether, and the trail, when the man she eventually engaged with the very last of her ready money finally picked it up weeks later, went entirely cold somewhere off the coast of Portugal. For the very first time in her life, Adeline Vane understood, with total and genuinely unbearable clarity, precisely what it felt like to stand in a doorway and watch her whole world carried out of it, piece by careful piece, by someone who had told her, and meant it, at least some of the time, that he loved her completely. She sat alone on the step outside her own empty lodgings for the better part of 4 hours, before she found anything resembling the strength to move again at all. Grief, she discovered slowly over the difficult weeks that followed, burns off considerably faster than one might expect when a person has spent her entire adult life carefully training herself never to need anyone else in the first place. What remained beneath it, once the very worst of it had gradually passed, was the exact same thing that had built her first fortune at 30 years old, a mind that had never once, in her whole life, simply stopped working merely because her heart had. She still knew things nobody could take from her with any power of attorney. She knew, with total and unshakable certainty, precisely how money moved and hid itself from view, because she had spent 30 years of her own life doing exactly that. She knew how a man like Julian would think, because she had once thought in those very same terms herself. A new city, a new name, a clean beginning purchased quietly with somebody else's ruin, and the same fatal, careless assumption she herself had once made without a second thought, that distance alone was ever the same thing as genuine safety. She had a few shillings and a borrowed shawl from a refuge for gentlewomen in reduced circumstances on her first night back in the city, sleeping 4 uneasy hours in a room shared with 2 strangers, and she still knew more about disappearing and successfully reappearing under a new name than almost anyone else alive. Mrs. Winslow, the refuge's soft-spoken matron, who had heard every version of every hard-luck tale imaginable over 20 years of the work, was the one who eventually found Adeline her first position, 4 hours nightly, sweeping and dusting a counting house 3 streets from where her own trading office used to stand. Mrs. Winslow never once asked what Adeline had done to end up there, and Adeline never once volunteered it, but there was a particular kindness in the not asking that she found herself thinking of, unexpectedly, for years afterward. On her second week at that counting house, an old night porter caught her sitting on the floor of an empty back office during her rest, staring at nothing in particular, and instead of reporting it, he brought her a cup of something warm from his own kettle and sat with her in silence for the remaining 10 minutes, asking nothing, offering nothing, only present. His name was Sam, and he never learned who she had been, and Adeline never told him, and she found, in the months that followed, that she preferred it so, that there was something almost unbearably restorative in being simply a tired woman on a floor to someone, instead of a name attached to a decade of gossip sheets. She kept the position even once the first small trading contracts began trickling back to her, working the night shift for another 4 months longer than she strictly needed the money, because something in her was not yet ready to fully let go of being ordinary, of being a person whose worst mistake was not the very first thing anyone learned about her. The man she eventually engaged to trace Julian, a retired Bow Street man named Petrie, who worked mostly in matters of desertion and had never in his career handled anything with so many noughts attached to it, told her early on that most people in her position gave up around the third month, once the trail went cold the first time, and the fees kept coming regardless. Adeline did not give up. She sat across from him at a chop house near the Exchange twice a month for the better part of a year, going through bankers' drafts and shipping manifests, line by line, with the exact same patient, unhurried attention she had once given a cargo tally, and Petrie told her, near the end of it, that he had genuinely never worked with a client who understood the money better than he did himself. "That is not a compliment I give lightly," he said. "I know," Adeline told him. "It is not the first time in my life it has been true. It is only the first time it has ever mattered for something worth doing." It took her 4 full months, working 2 positions and sleeping barely 4 hours most nights, to find the very first genuine thread, a draft routed carelessly through a small Lisbon banking house that had briefly, sloppily, used a variation of a name Julian had once mentioned, in passing, months before, belonged to a grandmother he'd apparently held dear. It took another 3 months after that, and every favor she had left anywhere in the world, to finally confirm the exact name he was living under now. Dr. Mercer was one of those favors, though he never once thought of it that way himself. He found her, quite by accident, sweeping a counting house floor at 11 at night in the same building where he still occasionally called on patients, and he did not walk past her the way she half expected he would. He crouched down instead, right there on the boards, and asked her plainly what had happened. She told him the truth, certain he would carry it straight back to Julian. He did not. He gave her a spare key instead, told her she was welcome by his fire for as long as she needed it, and asked no further questions she was not ready to answer. It was Dr. Mercer, in the end, who quietly settled the cost of Petrie's first retainer, a debt Adeline spent 2 full years afterward, slowly repaying, a little at a time, whether he asked her to or not. And it took, in the end, precisely 1 letter to finish assembling what she genuinely needed to do something real about it at last. A letter to a man in London she had not spoken 1 word to in 14 years, a man whose warehouse she had once emptied out, entirely, in a single ruthless night, without a shred of hesitation. She very nearly did not send it. She sat with the direction written out for 2 full days, before finally sealing it, entirely certain he would burn it unread the moment he recognized her hand, and entirely certain, deep down, that he would be perfectly entitled to do exactly that. He did not burn it. He came to see her instead and listened, in total unbroken silence, for the better part of an hour while she told him everything. Not to excuse a single part of it, she was careful to say so twice during the telling, but because she genuinely believed, for reasons she could barely put into words even to herself, that he was the one person left alive who would understand precisely what had just happened to her, because he was the one person left alive she had once, without hesitation, done the very same thing too. "I am not helping you because I forgive you," Marcus said finally, once she had finished, and his voice carried none of the old warmth she remembered from before that warehouse morning, 14 years earlier. "I need that understood clearly, before either of us says another word to the other. I do not need you to forgive me," Adeline said quietly. "I need you to hate him more than you hate me. I believe that may actually turn out to be true, once you hear the rest of it properly." It turned out to be entirely true, and it turned out to matter enormously, because in the process of methodically stripping Adeline of everything she owned, Julian had unknowingly moved money through accounts still, even after 14 years, tangled up in the unresolved suit Marcus had never fully abandoned pursuing through Chancery, in the quiet background of his own life. It gave Marcus, for the very first time since the night his warehouse was emptied, an actual legal foothold directly into the man who had, through no plan of his own making, through nothing more than sheer overlapping ill luck, stolen a second fortune that still had Marcus's original claim sitting invisibly beneath it the entire time. "I am not doing this for you," he told her again, firmly, before they parted that first difficult evening. "I want you to say it back to me plainly, so I know you understand it." "I understand it completely," Adeline said. "You are doing this because he is about to walk away clean with something I myself never once walked away from cleanly, and that is simply not a world either of us can go on living in." They spoke twice more before the suit was ready, both meetings short and businesslike, neither straying into anything resembling forgiveness. At the second, near the very end of it, Marcus asked her a question he had apparently been sitting on since the first. "Would you have written to me," he asked, "if there had been anyone else left alive with the reach to help you? Anyone at all?" Adeline thought of lying to him, briefly, out of old habit. "No," she said instead. "You were genuinely the only one I had left. I want you to know that. And I also want you to know that if there had been someone else, I believe, in the end, I should still have chosen to write to you regardless. I do not know what to do with that. I have been sitting with it for weeks." Marcus said nothing for a long moment. "I do not know what to do with it either," he admitted at last. "Let us simply see the suit through, and figure out the rest of it, if there is a rest of it to figure out, after." It took 8 more long months of careful, patient work. Julian's new life in Lisbon had, by then, taken on nearly every outward shape of something permanent. A new name settled comfortably into the local merchant registry, a small architect's practice, slowly rebuilding its client list, one careful commission at a time. A betrothed named Marisol, who had not the slightest notion her intended's true surname had ever once been anything other than the one on his papers. He had learned, it seemed, remarkably little from Adeline's own 14 years of careful invisibility, and rather more from her 14 years of quiet, settled arrogance. The same fatal, recurring belief that a person who has got away with something once will simply go on getting away with it, indefinitely, without consequence. It came apart entirely in broad daylight, in public, exactly as such things always seem to in the end. A joint suit, carefully coordinated across 2 jurisdictions by solicitors, Adeline and Marcus, had spent months and nearly all of what little money either had left assembling, landed without warning on a quiet Tuesday morning, with his true name printed boldly across the top of every document. Fraud, deliberate misrepresentation of identity, and a civil claim from Marcus Ashcombe, backed by a paper trail 14 years deep, and this time, fully and thoroughly documented from beginning to end. He tried, at first, to talk his way free of it, the way he had once watched Adeline talk her way free of things effortlessly, standing in a small Lisbon office, with 2 solicitors he could no longer properly afford. "This is plainly some misunderstanding," he said, more than once, to people no longer listening closely. "I built this practice myself, from nothing, with my own 2 hands." One of the solicitors, a sharp young woman named Dona Alves, engaged specifically by Marcus's people, simply slid a single sheet across the table toward him, a banker's draft dated 14 months earlier, routed directly through the very same account that had once, 14 years before either man had met the other, briefly held Marcus Ashcombe's own stolen silk money. "Your practice," Dona Alves said quietly, "was seeded with money that already belonged to another man twice over before it ever reached you. That is not a misunderstanding. That is simply the truth, written down." Julian had no answer for that. He sat very still in the small office for a long moment, the exact way Adeline herself had once sat still on a step outside empty lodgings, and understood, all at once and completely, that there was no version of the coming months that ended anywhere near where he had imagined they might. Adeline was not in that room herself, had not wished to be, but Marcus wrote to her that same evening from a terrace overlooking the Tagus, and she could tell, even across pages carried by a slow packet boat, that his hand carried something new in it. She had not heard from him in 14 years. He tried to say he built it himself, Marcus wrote, with his own 2 hands, as though the money beneath it did not signify, as though nobody would ever think to look beneath it at all. That was always his mistake, she wrote back, and mine, for a long while. One thinks if the house looks solid enough, nobody troubles to check the foundation. His next letter did not come for nearly a fortnight, long enough that she wondered whether he meant to write again at all. I will not pretend this makes us square, he wrote finally. It does not. It never shall, not truly. But I watched a man's face today do exactly what I imagine my own did 14 years ago, standing in an empty warehouse at 7 in the morning, wondering how I was to explain it to my own men. I will not say it mended anything. I will say it was something. It was something, she agreed, and neither wrote anything further for a while. Only the ordinary, unhurried business letters of 2 people who had, against all sense, become something like partners again. Marisol left the rooms she shared with Julian within the week, taking almost nothing beyond a single trunk and the ring, which she sent back to him a month later with no letter attached at all. She told a mutual acquaintance, later, that the worst of it had not been the fraud itself, precisely. It was realizing that a whole year of small, true-seeming moments, a hand at the small of her back in a crowded market, a particular way he had laughed at something she'd said over supper, had all been built by a man who apparently knew exactly how to make such a moment feel real, because he had lately had a very great deal of practice. Adeline did not recover her fortune. Most of it was gone for good, spent, or moved, or hidden well past any real hope of recovery, and she made her own uneasy peace with that particular loss, faster than she had expected to, somewhere in the long, grinding months of building the case alongside Marcus's people. But she gained something she had not honestly expected to want nearly so badly as she found, in the end, that she genuinely did. Every account Julian had carefully built under his false Lisbon name, every holding he had rebuilt piece by piece out of what he had originally taken from her, seized and handed over in full to the one man with an older, cleaner, more rightful claim to money that had, in the strangest and most fitting circle imaginable, passed through Adeline's own hands first, 14 years before any of this had ever begun. Julian Farrow lost every single thing he had stolen, to the one man in the world who had held every rightful claim to it, before Adeline or Julian, either one ever did. Adeline rebuilt slowly, carefully, the way people rebuild when they are, for what genuinely feels like the very first time in their lives, doing it entirely honestly. Small contracts, one at a time. 2 modest rooms, with no footman at the door, and nobody's shoulders dropping half an inch the moment she entered. No liveried men trailing behind her carriage anywhere. No convoy stopping traffic on the way to a position she now walked to herself, in boots she had bought with her own carefully saved wages. She wrote to her father, before she wrote to anyone else at all, not money, not any manner of settlement, not an explanation meant to excuse a single thing she had ever done to him, or to Edmund, only a plain apology, with nothing at all folded quietly behind it. He did not answer, for the better part of a year. When at last he wrote back, it was 4 short lines. No forgiveness offered outright in so many words, only a simple direction where she might send birthday letters to a niece she had genuinely never once met, a small girl who shared, according to the single miniature enclosed, her grandmother's exact smile. Grace Pemberton, who had never once told a living soul what she had done, learned what became of both Adeline and Julian second-hand, months later, through the same distant acquaintance who had once told her of the wedding. She sat with the news a long while on her own, turning it over carefully, and eventually decided, quietly, that she had done right after all, even though no one but Julian would ever know her small part in any of it, and even that, in the end, only barely. She never wrote to Julian again after the proceedings finally concluded. She had no need to. Somewhere in Lisbon, a man who had once left her a note 4 words long beside a woman he had drugged and abandoned on the road, was rebuilding a life for the second time, with genuinely nothing at all to his name, learning at last, in real time, precisely what it felt like to watch a door close firmly from the wrong side of it. She still thinks of Marcus sometimes, of the warehouse, of the exact night 14 years past when she decided, without a single real moment's hesitation, that taking was always simply easier than asking properly. She does not excuse it to herself anymore, not even quietly, not even on the hardest and loneliest nights. She simply carries it now, the way a person eventually learns to carry the true weight of something that can never be fully set down again. And every single morning she still rises and goes to her work, slowly, deliberately building something real this time, instead of something borrowed from another's ruin. Marcus never forgave her. Not fully, not in any way either would honestly call complete. No. But 2 years later, when his eldest daughter's small trading venture wanted for a backer nobody else in the city would seriously touch on account of the old family history still quietly whispered over dinner tables, it was Adeline who settled the sum, quietly, with no notice given, and it was Marcus who let her do it, without a single word passing between them as to why, and without either ever once raising it again afterward. Dr. Mercer stood as Adeline's witness the following spring, at a small hearing that finally, formally, cleared the last of her name from the fraud proceedings Julian's Lisbon men had initially tried to draw her into. He testified for a mere few minutes, said nothing dramatic at all, only confirmed the dates she had arrived at his door with nothing but a borrowed shawl, and afterward, on the courthouse steps, he told her plainly that he was proud of her, the way one says it to anyone who has earned it, and Adeline found she had to turn away a moment before she could answer him. Edmund wrote to her for the first time in 11 years the following winter, a short letter with no warmth in it and no anger either, only a single line asking whether the offer to know her niece still stood. Adeline wrote back within the hour. It took another year of careful, halting correspondence. Birthday letters, a small sketch of the girl's first day at her lessons, one stiff, formal call at Christmas that lasted a bare quarter hour and ended in a silence neither quite knew how to fill, before Edmund finally agreed to let her visit in person. She travelled south for the first time in nearly 15 years for that journey, and she did not call at a single one of her old warehouses, did not so much as pass by the townhouse she had once run her whole empire from, but spent the entire week instead sitting on her father's step, listening to him talk, slowly, carefully, about nothing much at all, which felt, to both of them, like a great deal more than either had expected to get. Nora still keeps the front desk of the small trading concern Adeline eventually rebuilt from almost nothing. 3 clerks now instead of 30, a single modest office instead of a warehouse row with a view of the river. She still draws a quarter above the going wage, and Adeline still has never fully explained why, and Nora, wisely, has long since stopped asking. If this story stayed with you tonight, hit the like button and share it with someone who still genuinely believes that reckoning takes its own time arriving, but never once forgets the address along the way. And tell me plainly, down in the comments, did the Widow of Rothermere truly deserve what Julian Farrow eventually did to her, given absolutely everything she had already done to 3 other people first? Or did his particular betrayal simply make an already ugly story a little uglier still, with nobody left standing in it that anyone could genuinely wish well? I read every comment, every single time. Subscribe, and I shall see you in the very next one.